Thank you so much. I basically am licensed professional counselor in Colorado, and I especially love coaching spiritual experiencers now that I'm back in Florida. I'm such an advocate for quantum psychology that people are basically trying to say, Valerie, you're a quantum psychology pioneer. And because of my experiences working with experiencers, I did write the book, Living in a Quantum Reality Using Quantum Physics and Psychology to Embrace Your Higher Consciousness. It's really like a self-help book. But I love bridging science and spirituality because I am a lifelong spiritual experiencer. So not necessarily a near-death experiencer, but spiritual experiences of all kinds. I've always felt presence. For me, there was presence in the space. It was very alive. It was very dynamic. It was constantly communicating with me regularly. And in the sixth grade, I had my first spiritual download. Essentially, we had learned about atoms that day in school. And of course, in those days, atoms were depicted as these little round things in space. And I kept wondering, like, well, how is that round thing in space know that it's part of the chair? But how does this round thing in space, these atoms, how does this atom know that it's part of me on that chair? And as many of you know, in came this huge download with the answer and essentially letting me know how everything is alive and conscious at every level, including the subatomic realm. And so that's essentially what led me to search quantum physics, probably starting in my 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, now in my 60s. And I've had all different kinds of experiences, but I'm just going to highlight one for a certain reason related to our talk. So one morning I woke up and I had just awakened from a realer than real dream that I was this Frenchman in the 1800s and or 1700s. And essentially, as that Frenchman, and I'm standing in his office, so to speak, and the equivalent of like a file folder is on his desk. And I'm astounded because as that Frenchman, I had awakened from a dream that I had been Cornelius Valerius. And it was very vivid on that file. And when I awoke in this life, I just kind of sat there dazed as I was contemplating, but it was so real that I Googled. I was like, wow, is there such a person? And it turned out there was. There is a Cornelius Valerius. He was a Dutch humanist and he lived in the 1500s. And when I looked into what he did, I was astounded at the similarities in his life and what he researched and what he was about and published about, and the same thing that excites me to do that in this life. Lots of different anomalous experiences, including one time a cross necklace appeared on my dresser out of nowhere while I was caregiving mom in recent years. And I was in a particularly distraught way. This holy card that you see in your upper left all of a sudden appeared out of nowhere on the top of my computer after a particularly hard day. And I probably spent the next 6 hours Googling what was up with that card and what was the significance of that particular thing manifesting on my computer. But these things are supposedly impossible, right? According to what we normally hear and according to regular psychology. I also remember a particular kind of a pre-death communication from my grandmother. She basically appeared to me one night in a dream that she was going to be passing within the month. And we weren't sad. It was the most incredible love, and we were bubbly, and we were talking and laughing. And it was like we were having this joyous tea party. And sure enough, she passed, but I was in a different state, and I just felt so appreciative that I was able to have that time with her. So bottom line, if the brain produces consciousness, then guess what? We're all delusional and these experiences are impossible. And this is what mainstream neuroscience is telling us. And it's very much because it's rooted in the cultural belief that the visible universe is all there is. And yet today, even in classical physics, the visible universe is only 0.0035% of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Less than 5% atoms. So guess what? That means 95% Physicists really have no idea what is going on. It's theorized and it's debated about whether it's dark energy, dark matter, or neutrinos, but they do not know. However, if research ends up showing that consciousness in fact exists beyond the body, is non-local, meaning it's beyond space-time rules, it seems to be multidimensional, everywhere at once, then these experiences are possible. But we do need more quantum informational theories of consciousness to underpin it, and it's going to radically change who we think we are, and it's going to change the field of psychology. So today I'm going to get into two parts, where in the first part, I briefly take you on a journey at how this multidisciplinary consciousness research, when you really look at it, the variety of it, the prevalence, some of the particular elements, why it can't be classical physics, because classical physics is associated with electromagnetic local signaling. And for those of you where that feels like a big element to chew on, I'm just going to say, pretend that energy travels through space like waves, and imagine that that looks like a pod of dolphins. And so notice that if it's oscillating at a particular frequency, or literally it's going through space at a particular time, it obeys space-time rules. And so that's why in our classical brain produces consciousness, they're going to say it's all about electromagnetic local signaling. But we're going to talk about how the research shows that electromagnetism is not at work in a lot of these. So we need to turn to more quantum and informational theories to help validate experiencers, and the concept of non-locality, the everywhere at once or simultaneous, no matter the distance. We need to turn to those things to explain it. And in part two, we'll talk about what does that look like when we're looking at the new kinds of theories? And I'm going to present 4 of them. And we're going to talk about, why does this matter? So moving forward, the variety of unexplainable experiencers, I'm going to use spiritually transformative experiences as the largest umbrella. And I'm going to say it includes near-death experiences and out-of-body or astral traveling, and all the psychic kinds of things, the clairs, the clairvoyant, clairsentient, all the clairs, the remote viewing, the spiritual downloads and telepathy, channeling, mediumship, after death and shared death communication. It includes the psychokinesis, or the apports from other dimensions, the synchronicities that we tend to start getting into when we're part of this spiritual reality more and more. It includes distant healing, and it includes these intention experiments where we're really having effects. One dream, it has a lot of significance for dreams, because one dream I want to share with you, this isn't mine, it was in dream research, but this one woman awoke from a dream, and she thought in the dream she had visited her husband on his nuclear sub, except for, as it turns out, her husband's roommate on the sub awoke at that time and saw her apparition next to her husband. So we had a veridical situation. We had somebody else verifying that she was really there in some kind of out-of-body state. So this basically defies all of these space-time rules. So electromagnetism uses the language of matter and energy, waves, and frequencies. And it's true that some of these types of spiritual experiences could involve just local physical signals and be explained away in that way. However, again, Faraday cages rule out this, and we're going to look at that more. We're also going to look at more of the spiritual experiencer data and prevalence. I mean, if 30 to 50% of us are having these experiences, depending on what the question is, we can't all be crazy. And there's lots of elements that really defy these electromagnetic explanations, like non-physical dimensions or interactions with such interdimensional beings, time expansion, time contraction, like in life reviews, when you can review your whole life, but in a moment of our clock time. When information is accessed from non-space-time dimensions, when we're living simultaneous lives, right? If the past and the future is all now, that is significant. What about when we simultaneously have many vantage points of perception at once. I remember a veteran who was about ready to, basically the plane was going to come in for a crash landing, and he saw that he was about ready to hit a big tanker full of explosives. And suddenly he was within every drop. He was himself, but he was the other people in the plane. He was also the Pepsi can that was now floating in the air in slow motion. He was every drop of the Pepsi that was floating around in slow motion. So again, these things are, needing other explanations. So when asked by the Pew Research Center in 2023, how many of you people from several times a year have felt a deep connection with humanity? 53% said yes. How about presence from beyond this world? 37% said yes. When asked if they had ever been visited by a dead family member in a dream or another form, 53% said yes. How about, hey, have you personally encountered a spirit or an unseen spiritual force, whether an angel or nonhuman intelligence? 30% said they had. In near-death research, Dr. Pim Van Lommel was looking at revived clinically dead cardiac patients and found that 18% of them remembered a near-death experience. There's over 5,000 firsthand reports, as many of you know, in that database. And again, they have veridical perception. So these things get verified by other parties. In the near-death elements, look at the prevalence of things like altered sense of time. 65% have experienced that. What about a sense of being in another dimension? 56% said yes, they had. And what about people who have been blind from birth, but in a near-death or out-of-body situation, they can see? This needs another kind of explanation. Same thing when very young children, they are not old enough to have known what these features are that they're supposed to be saying, but they basically describe the same features as adults. It's also similar across cultures, across religions. And as one of our group members said at the beginning, the after effects are profound. They have lasting changes on our personality, our sense of spirituality, and this is not explainable in regular psychology. What about non-physical interactions with others, traveling at the speed of thought? What about the life review, having all perspectives all at the same time? And these after effects are things like unquenchable search for knowledge and, I have to serve others. I know the quantum physics venture and psychology and spirituality, my whole life was just, I could not get enough. It was as if the universe was making me just keep researching all I could about how the intersection came together in these three distinct fields. So these are not, again, really explainable in regular psychology. There's negative after effects as well, as we know, and how sad that 70% of NDEers end up divorced. Why? Because if these things are considered impossible in regular psychology or medicine, and an experiencer ends up trying to talk to their family physician or a mental health therapist, if they get the sense that the therapist or the doctor feels they're crazy, or they get hospitalized for being crazy, notice their spouse is now going to feel they're crazy, and no wonder we have a high divorce rate. To me, that's tragic. Experiencers can tend to really struggle with an altered sense of reality. Like they know reality is not the way everybody here is saying that it is, and they struggle with that. They're quite distressed sometimes about this shattered worldview, especially if they were extremely atheist. What about past lives and reincarnation? How could it be possible that we access information across time? Dr. Ian Stevenson looked at over 2,500 cases, over 40 countries, specifically focused on children ages 2 to 6 who reported memories, was able to verify data even in the cultures not believing in reincarnation. He found that they started speaking about their experiences in another lifetime around ages 2 to 4, but they typically faded by ages 6 to 7 mostly because the family was not really supportive. You know, if a child keeps getting told you're imagining it or something like that, those memories seem to be repressed and would not, they couldn't remember. In over 200 cases, essentially birthmarks and physical traits ended up being correlated to the previous life. And especially for therapists, it's interesting to know that phobias ended up matching the past life. So maybe they have a phobia of something that didn't, you know, they're like, why? I remember one case was a young boy seemed to be extremely reactive and phobic of any loud sound, including if his mother was trying to bring him to a swimming pool and somebody would dive in, he basically would end up freaking out. And it ended up where a hypnotherapist greatly ended up helping the family because they found out that he had been in a early war and had been killed by cannon. So Jim Tucker has kind of continued the research of Ian Stevenson. He too found that these birthmarks and defects that correspond to the past life situation was found in about 20% of cases. I remember one case that's coming to mind that was particularly interesting because this family had let's say the oldest son, and then there was a second son. And then the first son passed, and then they had a third son. And the third son kept being quite spunky as he was saying things like, when I was here before. And they ended up concluding that the third son was the first son. And when he came in as the third son, his birth defects were similar, but not as severe as when he was there as the first son. 70% seem to have an unnatural or violent death. So maybe that's why the memories of these past lives are kind of leaking through a little bit more. Some of you might be familiar with the case of James Leninger, where he came in, he's this little boy, the family was not showing, you know, a lot of World War things, but he came in talking about being James in a before life. He would draw airplanes and people falling out of airplanes. He ended up saying something about a Corsair airplane and the Toma aircraft carrier and his friend Jack. And they did match these details up to a James Houston Jr. who died in 1945. And they ultimately had this little James go meet the family of James Houston. And they were absolutely convinced that this was their family member. Gary Schwartz ended up studying mediums because he really wanted to prove that they were all hocus pocus. And he found out the opposite. He found out that some mediums, like John Edwards, were definitely beyond chance levels of accurate information. It was statistically significant, these lines of research, even when the experimenters were blinded, even when things were randomized. Like, for instance, sometimes they would have these sit-in sitters for the actual real recipients, and the medium still got the data correct. Alani Wabe, some of you might recognize her name. She's a director of research at Institute of Noetic Sciences, and she's a channel. She comes from a family lineage of channels, and she has a current study out there, the trans-channeled content believed to originate from non-human intelligences. And she also has a book that came out recently on science of channeling that you may enjoy. After death communications, 20 to 40% of the bereaved end up reporting spontaneous after death communications. Shared death communications are a little bit newer. And essentially, it's like a near-death experience. It's just that the loved one who is passing, you might be in the room as a caregiver, and you're thrust into the vision of what they seem to be experiencing as they're going into the light and what have you. But apparently you have to come back at a certain point. This happens not only locally, like in the room, but it has been known to happen non-locally, even, let's say, many states away or countries away. I think one example, one man happened to be on a lawnmower mowing the lawn. And next thing you know, he's thrust into a vision and he's experiencing the passing of this person. And he found out later that at the exact same time, that person did indeed pass. So what he believed he had was a shared death communication. Out of bodies and astral travel, Dr. Charles Tart is a psychologist that was studying these even back in the 60s in controlled lab experiments. And Miss Z was one of those that was certainly able to perceive a 5-digit number that he had placed way out of normal sight, that the only way that they could have known that number would have been if they were indeed out of body. I'm bringing up this Benjamin Libet experiment for a moment because there's been a lot of debate by the materialist scientists, right? That we are all machines, that we don't have free will is an illusion. And it's interesting because a lot of that stems back to this experiment, because Benjamin Libet was studying voluntary acts. And he found that there are these electrophysiological readiness potentials that are showing up in cerebral activity that comes about 550 milliseconds before the act. And a lot of people ended up saying, oh, that proves that we're deterministic, that we don't have free will. But if you really look into his study, he said the final decision to act could still be consciously controlled during the 150 milliseconds or so remaining after the specific conscious intention appears. And he felt that conscious will can function in a permissive fashion. So it's as if the brain is receiving the information, but the conscious will can decide whether to allow that to come in or to prevent that conscious act. So, again, this whole free will debate. Presentiment and precognition, right? How could it be that we would have access to future information, especially future information selected randomly? But that's what's showing up in studies. Now, in presentiment, they're taking physiological measures. So 1 to 18 seconds prior is usually what they find. In one study, the brain and the heart activity were measured, and they found out that they were seeing a response 4 to 5 seconds before the future emotional picture that they were about ready to be shown was randomly selected. And the heart received the information about 1.5 seconds earlier than the brain did. Dean Radin over at Institute of Noetic Sciences studied presentiment. He was measuring heart rate and skin conductance. And yet again, before the emotionally images were randomly displayed, he could see the spikes happening seconds before. Julia Mossbridge, ended up doing a meta-analysis, and she found out that certainly human body differentiates between these randomly delivered stimuli, and the stimuli were really 1 to 10 seconds in the future. Now, precognition is, we might have a perception or a behavior, and we have studies that are measuring precognition, but it's different from presentiment, which is taking physiological measures. Now, remote viewing was funded by the CIA and the Department of Defense. They were doing some of this in the Stanford Research Institute, some at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, Paralab it was called. It's a very precise protocol. It's a kind of clairvoyance, but the person is given a target. Usually it was of secret facilities, or sometimes it would be just a latitude and a longitude. Sometimes it would be a specific military device that nobody really knew what it looked like on the inside except for the designer. And again, statistically significant results, even of future events that were selected at random. Or I have a friend of mine that was doing some of this remote viewing, and she was able to get very accurately, let's say, I forget the exact days, but let's say she's doing the sitting and having the session on a Tuesday, and her target, which she did not know what it was, but her target was a certain paper. Let's say the paper comes out on Saturday, and on a certain page in a certain place on the page, there's always a picture. So they decided whatever picture was on that page. But that picture was randomly selected from the day before AP database, and that the events didn't even happen until the day before that. So essentially, she's accurately drawing it when the event hadn't happened yet. The picture had not been selected, much less put on the page, and she didn't even know what the target was. So again, these are the kinds of things that people don't want to believe because they can't be explained by space-time physics. Telepathy, that mind-to-mind communication. They had a lot of Gansfield experiments where senders were transmitting messages to receivers. They were trying to block the electromagnetic signals with Faraday cages and a lot of these. And a meta-analysis showed statistically significant above chance hit rates, let's say 32% compared to 25% of chance. We have that whole other section of research, biofield science, energy healing, mind-body healing. I want to tell you about William Bengston's study. He was an atheist. He just knew energy healing was all bunk. And so he decided to do some experiments where people were not allowed to be an energy healer, but they had to be open. And he taught them a very specific protocol. And he decided, okay, what am I going to have them heal? I think I will pick this 100% fatal cancer. It was a mammary cancer. He picked it specifically because in the literature, it had been for decades 100% fatal, which means, let's say, if he's going to inject mice with this 100% fatal mammary cancer, even if one mouse ends up being cured by this quote, quote, energy healing procedure, then that was going to make, scientific literature history. Well, not only did one mice end up healing, but many, many did. And he wrote about it in The Energy Cure. What about psychokinesis and mind matter effects? Psychokinesis, that's without physical interactions. And again, the Pear Lab would have participants try to influence random number generators. Well, what is that? Imagine just some little electronic device that's programmed to put out random numbers, except for their intention was able to influence it in the direction of their intent, statistically significantly so. We today still have going on the Global Consciousness Project. They have random number generators around the world. And what they're noticing is they tend to stop being random in high global emotional events like 9/11. Apports, what about that? Even MIT physicist Claude Swanson was trying to study those. And I think he mentioned in one of his books that he had lost something and someone was able to manifest it right before him, this thing that he had lost as a child. So these things are happening. William Tiller was this regular conventional material science scientist in Stanford, very, very well known. And towards the later of his life, he decided to go out on a limb and he created the Tiller Foundation. He was an advanced meditator and he did all kinds of experiments that were really exciting. So the global intention broadcasting experiments he was doing between 2004 and 2013 were statistically significant. And what they were trying to do is, for example, several hundred people, can we reduce their depression or anxiety? They did. Can we change the pH of water? They did. Can we help these 39 parents and their autistic child around the world? They did. Furthermore, he had these meditators. Sometimes they were working with energy via the hand. Sometimes it was mind alone. He would block with the Faraday cage so they make sure it was not electromagnetism. And then they started, he got the idea of having them imprint a very specific intention into a simple electrical device. He called it an intention host device. And he found that this device would have experimental effects even after the experiment ended. And not only that, miraculously, it conditioned space itself. So those of us at this meeting, do we really care what gauge symmetry of space is? No. But isn't it cool to know that physicists measure space in this gauge symmetry and somehow the intention changed the physics of the space? And he believed that it was conditioning it to a higher level of physical reality. And not only that, exhibited over 5 unique behaviors that had never been seen before in our normal electrical space-time reality. So some of those experiments dealt with changing the pH of water. Some of them were working with liver enzymes and trying to see if the intention conditioned experimental space would work after 30 minutes exposure. It would. Hey, does this intention conditioned experimental space work on fruit fly larvae? It did. It improved their fitness and reduced their developmental time. So Charles Tart concluded by 2017 that there was so much data, hundreds of well-controlled experiments and hundreds of thousands of events happening to ordinary people, that essentially the big five didn't even need to be studied anymore. We already know telepathy works, clairvoyance, remote viewing works, precognition works, psychokinesis is done deal, psychic healing, all done deal. Does the world know that? No. By 2017, now, near-death experiences are in the evidence-growing pile, especially he loved that we were having more and more veridical kinds of data. Out-of-body, after-death communications, mediumship, reincarnation. So those are places where evidence is still growing. If you ask Dean Radin, Chief Science of Ions, he says, over a century of laboratory studies have investigated. Is it possible in principle for the mind to transcend the physical boundaries of the brain? Absolutely, it can. And yet, Western psychology is pathologizing and causing harm, right? At minimum, they dismiss us and call it hallucinations, magical thinking, delusions. But why is Western psychology taking this stance? Well, notice if science in general and society at large are completely divided over the nature of reality, much less consciousness, no wonder this is still happening. Now, those experiencers we're talking about, they are transformed, right? They no longer hold this mainstream worldview. They reject these materialist explanations of reality, and they want another explanation. Because remember, if the brain produces consciousness, then these experiences are impossible. If consciousness is found to be non-local, beyond space-time rules, more multidimensional, then now it's possible. So in this part 2, I'm going to share a little bit about what does it look like when we're diving into some of the theories of consciousness and why does it matter. So the materialist theories of consciousness, in a nutshell, their worldview is related to classical physics that are about local action, therefore electromagnetism with energy and waves taking time and space to travel. They are materialistic in their viewpoint. They really see atoms and molecules as bricks. We're made of things. They believe that these particles have a real independent objective reality out there, just like Newtonian thought space and time were objective absolutes until Einstein's relativity told that it was not. These materialist theories are reductionistic. What does that mean? Oh, you're just a sum of your parts. We're machines. It's deterministic in the way it's thinking. That's why free will is an illusion in their mind. And that's why I showed you the Libet experiment earlier. Basically, consciousness is seen as an epiphenomenon, even though they can't figure out why. The brain that supposedly isn't conscious now produces consciousness. And they keep studying neural correlates. Which part of the brain causes what? And where is memory stored? And they're doing it ad nauseum without making much progress on telling us anything about consciousness. And yet, according to even classical physics, this isn't quantum physics, this is classical physics. When they dive in and try to study these atoms and things, they find that they're actually 99.9999% space, which is why that conditioned space by intention that William Tiller was bringing up is astounding. The implications are astounding. But the funny thing is, what about the little speck of matter that isn't space? Well, they found that it too is made of 99.9999% space, no matter how far down the rabbit hole they go. And even more mind-blowing is, imagine a proton. Okay, that's pretty small. Imagine in a proton volume of space, they have calculated that there's more energy there than in all the known material universe. I mean, we can't even wrap our head around that. So what is this space? It's still a mystery, but let's look at the quantum world. So I'm going to show this slide again later, and don't worry about the details. Just notice that there are 4 sections to it. You have classical way up there at the top, and underneath that, this quantum realm of subatomic particles, and underneath classical also is the Planck scale. So this Planck scale, if you ever hear physicists talk about Planck scale, it just means that's the tiniest little units of space-time. So it's where energy or matter just start to emerge. It's where the quantum foam or the quantum vacuum is. And in a little bit, we're going to talk about, well, what could possibly be underneath that? And just know it's being called proto-physics because it's coming way before. So let's dive into a little bit of quantum language. If you really want to get an idea of this new world view, what on earth is it about? So when you look at it all, you find out that there's a oneness going on, just like experiencers know. There's a oneness to the system. There's a collectivity to it. Action is non-local. And that's what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, because it seemed like whatever kind of it couldn't be explained by electromagnetism because there were effects, even if there were distant parts even of the cosmos. And entanglement is an aspect of that. It's basically correlated behavior. So for example, let's just say that we have 2 entangled photons. And by the way, we really are made of light. And a photon is just the smallest unit of light. It's a quantum of light. And so let's say we take one photon that's entangled and we put it in London, and we take its sibling photon and put it in California, and someone tickles the photon in London. Well, guess what? The one in California laughs at the exact same time. Again, how is that possible? It's not with electromagnetism or classical physics. But in quantum physics, it's been proven repeatedly over and over again. So what are subatomic particles? They're actually not really particles. They're not bricks. They're more like probability clouds. It's as if they're all in a state of superposition, which means any possible state they could be in, they're in all states at once. And experiencers probably can kind of relate to that phrase. So example, if you can only be a 0 and a 1, they are 0 and a 1. If it can be only heads or tails, they seem to be both until you measure. And then all of a sudden, it's called the observer effect. Somehow this mathematical wave function that they're measuring the superposition with collapses into something very specific. And now it's all of a sudden, instead of all states at once, it's in a specific state. So instead of heads and tails, it's either heads or it's tails 100% of the time. When they measure, it's in a specific state and they don't know why. It's a mystery. It's still being debated. But what is this wave function thing anyway? If anybody ends up going in this down this rabbit hole and they're interested, I'll just let you know it's math. So see this. I don't know if you can see. Those of you driving obviously can't see. But for those of you looking at the slide, you're going to kind of notice this picture that I've been showing on my slides. And I've been showing it for a reason. And if you look real close, these where my cursor is are 0s and 1s. And it looks like there's just a bunch of 0s and 1s as if they're making little ocean waves. And the little tiny waves are like little, tiny bumps. And then there's larger bumps. And this is actually what a wave function looks like. It's just math. It's a probability distribution. So where there's a little bump, you're going to have more probability of a particle being there than in the flatter parts. But in the larger bumps, you have higher probabilities there. Don't worry if this doesn't make sense. It still doesn't make sense to a lot of the physicists. And so these are state probability amplitudes. It's causing this huge debate even among quantum scientists, which is why psychology is so slow to catch up, because we're still waiting for the physicists to figure out what do they want to say about it all. But the non-realists are saying, okay, look, we know that quantum theory is the most successful theory ever, but guess what? This is math, and we can't say anything real about reality. So shut up and calculate. And you're going to have those that disagree, and they're going to say, oh, yes, we can. And one of those is John Archibald Wheeler. He's an early quantum physicist, and he basically looked at the data over and over, and he's like, look, reality is co-participatory. The universe is co-participatory. We play a role. So quantum field theory just happens to be one of many theories in quantum physics. So if anybody ever tries to say anything about quantum physics, just know that there's many theories out there. It's not just one thing. A field in quantum physics, though, in quantum field theory, it's not a field like an electromagnetic field. It is math. So this little ocean, this graph that I was showing you behind, the picture behind the graph, it looks like a field. So they're calling it a field because they don't know what else to call it. But particles are not things. They're just anywhere you have a bump on the graph, they call that the particle. That's an excitation of a field. So an electron has an electron field. A photon has a photon field. Where is the electron? Where the bump is the biggest. So in some of these quantum information theories of consciousness, the worldview has flipped. Now, it's consciousness that's fundamental, and it's matter and space-time that are emergent from consciousness. Consciousness is non-local. It's beyond space-time, just like experiencers have known all along. And it's more multidimensional and even hyperdimensional. There is no more determinism. It's about probabilities. Anything that can happen is happening at some point in time. And there's no independent objective reality in this quantum data. Observation changes what is observed. So I'm just going to briefly give you an idea of what would a quantum informational theory of consciousness look like. And I'm not going to get into too details, but I'm just going to show you that even the four that I'm picking are very different. So they too each have their own theories. So for example, there's one called orchestrated objective reduction. It's by the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff and the Nobel Prize winning physicist Sir Roger Penrose. Objective reduction relates to that whole collapse of the wave function thing. Orchestrated, because of the word orchestrated, kind of seemed to relate to entanglement. So in this theory, there's a role for entanglement, making it more quantum, as well as gravity. But they believe that this wave function thing does say something real about reality. They really believe in a real collapse of a quantum wave function is very real. And it somehow collapses to a proto-conscious moment. So in that case, that proto was that last category at the end of that graph I was showing you underneath Planck. Somehow proto-conscious arises there. So consciousness is non-local, but not fundamental there. It's more a classical and quantum theory. And in that theory, you know, there's a lot of argument whether biology can actually be quantum at all, because most of the time people dealing with quantum particles have to keep things in a very cooled environment. And they're saying, no, you know, the body is too wet and warm to hold anything quantum. So you guys are all just making this up. But in this theory, Hameroff said that microtubules would be a really good candidate. Microtubules are within neurons. And Anirban Bhattacharya, he's a quantum physicist who's working to develop a quantum brain. And essentially, he did find quantum oscillations within the microtubules. Tom Campbell has this, he calls it his my big toe, meaning theory of everything model. It's essentially, he calls everything virtual reality. So we're virtual reality with our virtual bodies and avatars and our virtual worlds and our game maps. But he says it's all real reality. It's just a more scientifically productive way to understand the experiments and the data. He does believe that, you know, it is a multidimensional reality, that there's a larger consciousness system, which for us is consciousness, capital C. And he says, how do we change from one to another? It's our intent to help. We use our intent to shift data streams. It is a probabilistic, not a deterministic type of simulation. And I'll just point out that he definitely believes that these reality cells, like he calls them, have free will. And we are all these players in consciousness. Federico Fagin has a quantum information-based panpsychism model, and he sees that these little sadies are these little consciousness units with permanent identity and free will, and they just keep cohering to increasingly larger bodies of consciousness, kind of like, nested dolls within nested dolls. He believes that these quantum states really are real and they actually exist. It's not just math. And space-time is how our embodied consciousness perceives through our body, through these reductive sensory brain mechanisms. Reality is alive, is how he really believes it. And this quantum information represents our whole semantic world of meaning. Information is live. He calls it live information. And it makes up our physical world of space-time particles and virtual particles, and that they can influence our space-time. And he says that's why the physical world and life are both quantum and classical. We are body and non-local consciousness, right? So Doug Matzke's model is the last one I'll show you, and he does the most math, but imagine that he likes bit language. And today, quantum is so associated with bits of information. So imagine that one bit is in that proto-physics layer, and one bit is, you could call it a vibration. You can't call it energy, but maybe you call it information or vibration. But imagine it's the tiniest little distinction of information we could possibly imagine. And it's at that level of the proto-physics. And that they're actually, he loves to call them existons because he sees them as these elementary discrete units of consciousness. And in his model, consciousness is fundamental. And he has a way to explain our experiences, our qualia and meaning and laws of attraction and things like that. But it's a mathematical theory. So for consciousness researchers, he can show how bits can combine and create these hyperdimensions or these, multiple dimensions by increasing in their complexity. He also says they're orthogonal. So for mathematicians, that means something like 90 degrees. But what it means for us is that they're like their own little mini universe. And at this proto-physical level of bits, they can construct into the Planck scale and the quantum vacuum and foam, and eventually to all the standard model particles. So for consciousness researchers, this is going to be very important to have us make true progress and end up getting to the point where psychology might start paying attention. So there's that graph again. And just to show you what on earth would he mean by bits, I'm just going to hold up fingers. So if you're driving, don't look. But imagine if I'm holding up one finger and that's one bit. And I hold up a second finger and now that's 2 bits. It's called a qubit. Now imagine I hold up a third finger and now we have a qubit. And if I hold up 4 fingers, that is 2 qubits. So now we have an entangled bit. And you can just imagine how he can start constructing and adding all these things up in the way we talked about. But what's of interest to experiencers like me and perhaps you guys is about light, right? We're said to be made of light and made of photons. And he sees that this proto-physical qubit of 3 bits is basically the proto-physical level where the photon starts to come alive, if you will. Now, how do we just review what we just said? So these theories of consciousness go from very materialist, physicalist to non-physicalist. And in that classical materialist kinds of theories of consciousness, particles are ruling. It's all about electromagnetism, and somehow consciousness emerges from this machine brain. But in the quantum informational types of theories, it's consciousness that's ruling, and space-time emerges from that. And there isn't energy. It's more non-local, somehow simultaneously, regardless of distance, with these entangled effects, with these quantum probabilities, right? We say our quantum field of potentiality. How often have we maybe heard that? The observer effect is at play. And again, there's that graph again. It's just that basically we have these nothings, these no things that are somehow making up the things. So how interconnected are we? When you look at all the data, we really are one consciousness, a part whole, a classical quantum collective. We are at the quantum and informational levels like one body. Our boundaries are illusory. We are attracted together like an organ with meaning and purpose and function, and even atoms and cells. Imagine that they really are truly little conscious beings, and that any of us as a conscious being, no matter how small or large, we still miraculously are a unique combo of qualia. Consider that we are in interdimensional communication all the time with self, with others, different time, spaces, and dimensions, all simultaneously. And imagine that our intention and intention are key. So, why would this matter to psychotherapy? Well, for therapists, imagine that self actualization is no longer about a separated ego actualizing in their career, but it's about living from a higher self or a soul that might even have missions across lifetimes. Imagine that if we have quantum information, ways of looking at therapy, then we can use this information about different times and dimensions and informations. Like, for example, imagine if we have a client rescript the past. At the quantum level, that changes us in the now because we're completely interconnected. Imagine that we can visit our future self or a higher self in our mind's eye and have it affect us now. Imagine that here in space time, we're really struggling to forgive, right? That's going on a lot right now. We have a lot of anger and a lot of struggles to forgive. But if we go into a meditative state and have the higher selves of all of us go into a room and start discussing things, love just pours, forgiveness happens. So why would it matter to each of us individually? Consider we are a multidimensional self with access to these other dimensional realms. How does that change us personally and the way we live our lives? Imagine that we really do have a field of quantum potentiality and that we really might have an eternal pattern that continues over lifetimes. Imagine that every thought and mood affects every other across all dimensions, locally and non-locally. Empaths, intuitives, and channelers know this. Interconnected as one. Imagine we're affecting all beings in all realities, all in the now. Wow, boy, do we have to choose responsibly. Why would it matter for our health and our well-being? At the physical level, imagine that it really is about aligning our actions with this higher self and nature's rhythms. At the emotional level, imagine that resonance, right? Those waves that are swimming like dolphins, whether that's a real electromagnetic thing at the classical level as well as a quantum resonance level. Imagine that anytime we have a positive emotion, it's because we're resonating with that, even non-locally. And when we have a negative emotion, it's reflecting the degree of non-resonance that's at play. At the mental level, imagine that we really do need to listen and quiet the mind so that this interdimensional guidance can come in as intuition. Regular psychology doesn't even acknowledge intuition, and they basically operationally define it so poorly that they keep saying it's the same thing as instinct. It's not. At the spiritual level, if we borrow chakra language, imagine that basically the first through third ego chakras are basically the body for the upper chakras to pour through, and it's about aligning that. So in short, wow, we really are in telepathic interconnectedness and communication with all other dimensions and selves, and it's our birthright. And within multiple realities, all at the same time, we're in a state of co-creating, and that we really are intended to live intuitively. And what if dreams really aren't just dreams of the subconscious, but portals to other consciousness streams? And if this is true, how do values and meaning and purpose shift for our lives? So I'm totally fine to take any kind of questions or discussions or anything anybody wants to bring up.
Well, I'm overwhelmed, Valerie. That was absolutely amazing. And I feel like I don't know about the rest of you, but I feel like I need to have you do it all over again because it was a lot of information. And I guess my question is, I did order your book, Quantum Reality, and I'm hoping that a lot of this will appear in your book. Is that what I should be expecting?
Well, what I talked to today is probably deeper on the technical end that I got to in the book. However, in the first chapter of the book, I did discuss all of these terms: energy, waves, fields, quantum, resonance, entrainment, uh, even things like holographic. Like I took all of those in the first chapter. You will be introduced to every single one of these key terms: observer, effect, all of those, but in a very light way. It's very much in the first chapter just light, because most of my clients just wanted to know a little bit about it, but not too much. So that's what I gave in that first chapter. And then the rest of the book is self-help, because experiencers tend to have a lot of things in common. And I noticed in my therapy and private practice, they really wanted to know that. They wanted to know that they weren't alone. And some of the things that they were struggling with was really common to a lot of experiencers. And so that's why, as you go through the various chapters, there's self-help and there's exercises at the end and all kinds of things. And in a way, for fellow therapists, it's just an example of what might a quantum view of therapy look like. You kind of get a glimpse of what it might be like to be in my therapy room in those days, if you will.
Right, right.
I am working on a new book with Doug Matzke. And I picked him because he and I were talking, and he does go deep into the math. And the next book that we're going to bring out is going to be more aligned with tonight's conversation, is going to go a bit deeper down the rabbit hole. And we're going to address some of these gaps and talk about how do we fill these gaps in our knowledge.
So one of the things that I enjoy are conferences and going to IANS, of course, but are you speaking at any of these future conferences in the next year so that we can, I mean, I'd love to go to a conference that you're actually really teaching in so that I can learn, glean more information.
Well, thank you for that. I have spoken to, for instance, the Denver IANS 2017 in-person conference. I was there. I've at a different one, Spiritual Awakenings International. I've done some of those. I am looking at it, and I'm looking at creating a more quantum psychology type of coursework for therapists, by the way. And I've had more people inquire about it. And so I've been debating how much do I spend time on getting that course out, as opposed to then I met Doug. And it's like, Doug, we got to hurry up and get this book out. And like you said, I really want to get out and be able to spread this information around these conferences for certain.
Absolutely. Well, I hope you're thinking about presenting at the IANS in Seattle next year. That's for sure.
Thank
But
you.
if you do something ahead of time, definitely I'm in. Thank you so much.